I'm Leslie Elliott Boyce, and this is The Radical Center, a recording project I began in 2022 as a way to describe and discuss the social and ideological currents that are rapidly altering our culture. In a time when political polarization seems to be the norm, I'm seeking to understand rather than react. I'm grateful to all the thoughtful men and women who share their stories and insights with me in this conversation series. If you would like to contribute to this project financially, there are links in the description. Thank you, and thank you all for listening and being part of this exploration. Well, today I'm speaking with Dr. Jon Mills, and Jon, you are a psychologist based in Canada, and I've read some of your articles, and I'm really interested in having a discussion with you and seeing where it goes. Would you mind starting by giving a little bit of your background, saying a little bit about yourself?
Well, sure. Well, thanks for having me on, Leslie. I'm a retired clinical psychologist now, and but I'm still quite active in my academic, pursuits and teaching and writing and also supervising. But yes, I've become interested in many of the areas that we have in common since becoming aware of the takeover of critical social justice in our mutual fields. And I find it to be very troublesome at the very least, and find that very few people are willing to speak out about what I think is absolutely atrocious that's happening to the field. I can go on, and maybe we'll have a conversation about each piece of it, but clearly the wokeification of the field, the almost obsessional, if not psychotic emphasis on difference and race and identity politics and all the other buzzwords that come with critical race theory and intersectionality and everything under the sun that is basically anti-white racism. So I started, to be more vocal about it and start writing on it, and here we are today.
Mm-hmm. When do you feel like you started to notice something was changing in this way?
Well, when I was watching your videos,
Oh.
when you were going through that horrendous time at Antioch, and I had no idea that this was happening in the field, meaning that turning traditional mental health training programs or counseling or whatever it might be, social work, psychology, psychoanalytic practice into this ideology that we live in a white supremacist society, and we are systemically racist, and we should be taught how to intervene as social activists rather than as helping professionals who view everyone with empathy, dignity, compassion, and not paint these binary categories. So that's when I realized, wow, is this what's happening out there? And I started to become more interested in educating myself, and then experiencing my own field have more or less a coup takeover and corrupt the way we relate to one another. So that's where we're at. Leads me up to today.
Mm-hmm. So it was really those first videos introduced this problem to you. That's really interesting. So that would have been in 2022, so fairly recently.
Well, I was watching the critical therapy anecdote closely, and you started to appear on that, and reading the articles and becoming educated by that, or I think very influential organization.
Were you already retired from practice at that point?
Well, I did during the pandemic, so it was 2021 when I was wrapping up with my caseload and my clinical practice. So I had a bit more time on my hands at that point to educate myself about the greater dangers or existential threats to the field.
And you, so after that, you said you started to learn more about it and see it more. And how did you start to see the sort of ideological processes impacting mental health work?
Well, the first, I guess, is when I saw that an esteemed psychoanalyst could publish a paper in the leading organization of American psychoanalysis, which is the American Psychoanalytic Association's journal, that white babies are born racist.
Oh my gosh.
And I thought, how could this even appear
Sounds like a joke
in print? Well, I thought it was a joke at first. I thought it was a spoof, like something that Stokel would have written and gotten published. But sadly enough, it's not. So it was not a peer-reviewed paper. It was written by Donald Moss, and it was allowed to be published by the then editor of JAPA, which is the Journal of American Psychoanalytic Association, Mitchell Wilson. They're buddies, they're pals, and he allowed it to be published without a proper peer review. And then, of course, it hit immediately national news, where a lot of enraged people came out of the woodwork. And in fact, Moss received death threats, and so did any of the American psychoanalytic institutes that he was affiliated with received bomb threats, and they had to close it down and get security involved.
Wow.
So that's when I decided I was going to write a response, and which was suppressed by the editor, and I placed it in another journal, and then I started getting canceled in some circles, ridiculed, and questioned. But I mean, I could go on with all kinds of little things, but that's kind of where I got my feet in the water at that point.
Do you have a sense of why this is taking off? Why this is so pervasive right now?
Well, I believe that the racialization in society has taken place for probably about at least a decade, but with George Floyd's murder, brought everything out of the woodwork, and at the height of the pandemic. And so I think if we just see or witness how people were very quick to want to get on the bandwagon of there's nothing but white supremacy and systemic racism that's driving the country, and people wanted to be on the virtue signaling side of history, and wanted not to get in hot water by challenging some of these basic assumptions that are just taken at face value, rather than to be able to logically question, assess, analyze, debate, critique without being called a racist. So I could see how people were just terrified to not want to rock the boat, not say anything, and let people of color. I can't stand those terms, by the way. I don't like using identity politics, but given that's what people do, they wave the flag. This is what I am, who I am. It sounds like we can't escape that. I prefer to call a person by their heritage. So I like the African American better lingo, but it seems like this is where we're at. We're color categories now. And so basically, there's so many different ways of trying to analyze or understand why this would take on a mass movement as it has. So I'm not going to pretend to have much insight in that right now, given our conversation. But nevertheless, people have jumped on the let's change the curriculum, let's change the discourse, let's just keep spouting certain propositions without being able to think about, question, or engage in some type of serious logical analysis of these propositions. And if you are, then you're going to be in hot water. You might be canceled. You'll be devalued. You'll be dehumanized in public spaces. You'll be called a racist and every other ad hominem name under the book simply for being white. And that's what happened to me. And at this point, I could care less what names you want to call me. If you don't have any intellectual integrity or, a bravery to have a discussion, a dialogue, a conversation with me, then, you can go back to, sophistry 101 and have fun. But you would not pass my introductory critical thinking class.
When I was starting to sort of pick up on these racial currents in I guess popular political culture when I went back to school in 2019, and so I was kind of concerned about where the school was going with this already. I picked up on some of the identity politics there, the gender pronouns and things like that. And it was my second quarter that I had to take this diversity module, this course called Multicultural Perspectives, which was a full course in my curriculum. I had to pay full tuition for it, but it was, and I really hoped that it was going to be taught sensibly and sensitively, because what I was thinking is there's a lot to talk about with regard to race and minority status and how that impacts a person, the potential impacts that has on a person individually and socially. And it's such a complex topic that it really deserves deep sensitivity and really deep exploration. But what I found instead was that it was taught in this very cartoonish manner. And it really shocked me because the teacher is a PhD in psychology. She should have had the training and the background to understand these nuanced psychological processes and concepts and be able to really bring some thoughtfulness to this dialogue and make it a real discussion. And instead, we were being told white women are Becky's, and there's white, and then there's, like you say, people of color, which seems like a kind of an insulting nonsense category, really, because it just means non-white. It's lumping people from really disparate backgrounds and ethnicities into one big category just to put them opposite of white. And something I just found so shocking was that I'm in other courses in this program where I'm being taught by really thoughtful people who are very well educated. I studied psychology in undergrad, and I studied law. I went to law school, and I had been even my community college where I studied literature had more sensitive dealing with human psychology, with human processes and the ways that we operate and the interconnections and the nuances of our behavior and our relationships. That this kind of stuff, this ideological race, whatever ideologies, it was that it could be taught alongside these really deep, interesting topics by people who were educated in human psychology shocked me. I would have thought that the psychologists would be the first people standing up to say, no, that doesn't make sense. Like, let's have a more detailed, nuanced conversation about the subtleties of identity. But to have the psychologists supporting this and not condemning it has been extremely disappointing and surprising, and it's shaken my faith in education completely.
Yeah, well, you obviously had a thoughtless teacher.
But not
And
just the teacher, the program supported that.
well, certainly Antioch is a very progressive, far liberal institute, at least it has been historically. In some ways, I guess we shouldn't be surprised that it would attract these more illiberal, radical left people. But I also find that most professors who teach in clinical or applied programs don't actually practice therapy. And they pontificate, but they don't know how to really, act clinically. So there are those of us who like to keep in both realms, so we know what's real and what's just some type of intellectual masturbation. But doesn't it sound so childish to pit people against one another? And not only that, just completely unproductive, a way of infantilizing alterity. And when when you're thinking about social collectives that are outside of America, but even within the U.S., U.S., Canada, UK, I mean, we're the most ethnically diverse country Western society sees for democratic countries, and so multicultural. And the thought that like one group is dominating another, the thought that all other quote minority identifications would be lumped into some kind of aggregate as if they're all the same, as if everything's homogenous here and everything's homogenous there, and it is such a splitting of not only of psychology but of logic. It's false dichotomies. And you wonder about the unconscious identifications that people who are identified as disenfranchised or othered or whatever the lingo we're using, they're not part of a minority, or they're a minority, not part of a majority group. But I mean, even whites couldn't possibly be all considered the same. I mean, there's vast disparities in class, education, values, wealth, and equity. The thought that we're all the same is about as ridiculous as it could even get. And then that we would all have the same value systems and think alike. Oh yeah, that's a good one. Especially when the country is divided half and half now, in terms of politics. So these things are kind of ridiculous. So why are people buying into the binary thinking? So do I mean, I'll ask you this. Often people don't speak this out loud because, of course, they're going to be called, you know what, the R word. But isn't there some element that the those who identify as the underdog are getting a great deal of preferred satisfaction seeing Whitey get pilloried
Hmm.
and get beat up, get attacked, get accused, get humbled, get on one knee after showing your deference, given you're so privileged.
Mhm.
But that does not go over very well with people. Dehumanizes them. They
Mhm.
shames them. You know, they're being guilt tripped. It's a form of pathological accommodation, like to some kind of cruel parent that
Hmm.
we have to please and never say anything to upset them. And it takes a strong psyche and will and a person who has agency to say, I'm not putting up with this bullshit. And I'm willing to not only call you out on it, but I'll discuss it with you. But we can't even have a debate because you've already been, smeared.
Well, I think that the one of the things that seems so insidious about this this critical race theory and the racial ideologies that we're seeing is that they're primarily being implemented through education. And so two things. One, I wish that I could blame my experience on one particular institution. I wish I could say, well, it was a school that I went to that was far left, and so what do you get? You get what you get. But the outpouring of communication that I've gotten from other people around this country, or in Canada and around the world, in the UK, I've gotten so much feedback from other people, and I've spoken with so many people that I now see this as a much more pervasive problem. It's not a problem of one or two left-leaning institutions. And I've always not now. I mean, I named the channel the Radical Center because I found myself really alienated from the left, and I'd always been on the left. And I also didn't quite align perfectly with the right either. So I kind of find myself in this position of almost like on pause politically, just trying to digest and observe, really. But the when I went back to school, and I was in my early 40s, and I was not the oldest person in the course. There were people my age and even older, but probably the average person in that program was maybe around 30 or something like that. I What I noticed was these people all knew the right language to use. They knew how to talk about their privilege. They had this language that they were really comfortable using. It was mostly white people in the course, and I don't even like you. I don't like those identity labels. White. I grew up where white was a slur because I was in a minority white area, and white was really used as a derogatory slur. I never liked it. I preferred Caucasian when I was a kid if I had to identify myself as a race. But so most of the other people in the program were also light-skinned Anglo-American Caucasian people, and they knew the language. They knew how to talk about these things in a way that was foreign to me because it hadn't been something I was exposed to previously. And, when I started talking with my daughter about this, she's 26 now, and she remembered being taught the genderbread person when she was in high school. So that's 10 years ago. That was already being taught. So the gender stuff was coming through. And when she was in school, they started with the racial stuff, especially when she got to college. And she went to college a little before I went to graduate school. And it was really hard on her to hear this because she was studying Mandarin and had loved it. She was fluent. She'd been an exchange student in China and had such a good experience in high school. But when she got to college, this is cultural appropriation, and it's not appropriate for you as a white girl to be to be speaking this language. So she kind of had this whole different perspective, and it was really hard on her. It really kind of shattered an identity that she was just forming. And something that I thought that I've contemplated as I've been trying to understand all of this is the coming back to what I said about how insidious this is, that it's being taught in education, because we're seeing it in K through 12. So young people who are still forming an identity are being offered this, as you say, the split. There's good and bad. We have marginalized and oppressor, oppressor and oppressed. And for people, kids are growing up is hard, and finding your identity is really hard. Figuring out, how am I important? How does life have meaning? And all the struggles that a person has in their life. And if they're offered this kind of framework by authority figures that seem benevolent and seem to want to help them, which teachers ideally seem like they do, that it's so tempting, especially if you are the targeted person, and that's the person of color, if you will, that lump, that big giant group that's kind of amorphous and meaningless. But if you are a person who can fit that category, or an LGBT or whatever, the marginalized groups, then you're the target of this, in a way that it offers you an opportunity to see the world very simply and put yourself in a heroic place. And so when you say, like, would you not want to see what was your word? It was like, you see Whitey get put down or something like that. Well, of course, I think you would, if you have been tempted into this way of thinking, that would appear to be a victory, because it's a vanquishing of evil so that good can triumph. And it's so simplistic, but it's so totalizing and so tempting to take on that worldview, if that's a way that you've been educated to think. And I think it does, like you said, it takes a lot of psychological integrity and strength to resist falling into those simplistic worldview, pathways. It's just so tempting.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, I guess, a long response.
No, yeah. I mean, it's just to compare our daughters. I have three daughters. 36 is the oldest, and youngest is 20. Mm-hmm. And now it might be that being in Canada, it's a little different than the US, because the town I live in, the high school that two of my daughters went to, are the dominant group is the POC people. Mm. And so whatever you want to lump us all into as Caucasians or Anglo or European ancestry, we're the minorities here.
Okay.
In the suburb. And so there's much more of a feeling of, at least according to my experiences, having employed many different people from different countries for my mental health corporation. India, African, Filipino. I mean, you can go on and on. There isn't those tensions. There wasn't so much the tensions in the school system either. The kids just, identify with each other as kids, and where you come from. So that was nice to see that wasn't so much of an issue. But certainly, I grew up in the United States. I know exactly what that feeling of division can be like, and watching it, witnessing get worse and worse over 30 years after I immigrated here, after 30 years ago. It's sad to see that instead of having more of shared identifications in culture, that of course is dispersed everywhere. I mean, look at music. I mean, You can't culturally appropriate music, of course, let alone, you can't, you can't even go to a Chinese restaurant now,
Mm-hmm.
according to your daughter's
Mm.
experience. I mean, how ridiculous these things are. But when we're conditioned to think this way by teachers
Mm-hmm.
in media, and there are guilt inducements based upon the mere fact that you just were born a certain
Mm-hmm.
skin color, um, is not really helping matters. When I was in graduate school many years ago, we had multicultural education as well that was taught by someone from that culture that's different than Anglo culture. And it was not ever introduced in these pejorative, devaluing ways.
Mm-hmm.
And it was introduced as educating you on people that you didn't grow up with. And yes, it did lead to some experiences of tensions between people, but I mean, it wasn't nearly the same as what you've been subjected to, or your daughter, or you're kind of put through some kind of ideological, gauntlet
Mm.
that you have to, get through, and hopefully you won't get beat or battered too bad before you get the other side here, like a Clint Eastwood movie.
Yeah.
Um, but uh, this is something I really haven't thought a great deal about. But now that we're talking about it, what are the psychological um, reasons for this?
Mm.
Why are people so quick to want to create divisions, um, given that identity and difference are dialectically in relation to one another? You can't have one without the other.
Mm-hmm.
And we all have a sense of identity that's different than others, as
Mm-hmm.
well as we've identified with certain, aspects of humanity that we've integrated within our own unique personalities. So that's what makes us all different. Uh, so how is it that we could take such complexity
Mm-hmm.
and water it down into two pools, and
Mm-hmm.
then, as you put it, elevate one as an oppressor and put the other one down as the oppressed?
Mm-hmm.
And like, who's teaching you this? Have you had a logic class here?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Yeah.
so like a lot of friends of mine tease me because I'm too cerebral at times, I'm too rational
Mm.
about things. But on the other hand, I certainly see that we're living in a state of irrationality that's an
Mm-hmm.
emotive that is like taken over the way we come to perceive our social realities.
Mm-hmm.
And when they're so bifurcated that
Mm-hmm.
we have such different realities, where one person's reality is solely based on feelings or their unique lived experience,
Mm-hmm.
that they would not even entertain the fact that there's an objective reality out there. Does your feelings or perceptions match up with evidence? And this is where I think we're in a stalemate as a society, that people have different values and different perceptions of reality.
Mm-hmm. And what do you do with that stalemate?
Well, if we want to think about it as a therapy patient,
Mm-hmm.
um, how do we sit down and have a dialogue? Well, we have to listen to
Mm-hmm.
the other person. And this is not always easy when what you're having to hear sounds either foreign or crazy,
Mm-hmm.
or not or projection or whatever it may be. But if we can do that, at least you're showing that you're interested in understanding their experience.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then if that goes well, might open up to other parameters.
Mhm.
Um, I'm just spouting off the top of my head. I don't know what to do, but if we could
Mhm.
get some form of mutual recognition, or create a space for hospitality between people coming together,
Mhm.
maybe that's a start.
I've wondered if some of this is a product of an overly bureaucratic culture where there's less opportunity for individual meaning and there's more like um my kids, my daughters who are both now in their mid to late 20s, when they were little, they went to an elementary school that was really small. It was so lovely. It had like 500 kids in the whole school. And the entire school would meet in the morning for morning assembly. And the teachers were just really checked in and cared about the kids and knew all the families. I knew a lot of the other families there. They really got to spend individual time with the students. Even the principal knew most of the students. I mean, because there were only like 500 kids there. So it was really beautiful. And not, I guess it's not even really important, but they were definitely in the minority as Caucasian kids at that school. And it was also in an economically depressed area. I was a single mom, and it was a really crappy area right off the highway, right next to a strip club that was grandfathered in because it had been there since before the decency laws prohibited putting that kind of place next to a school. So it's not in a nice area, poor apartment living population, almost all single moms. You never saw dads at that school. And yet it was such a lovely school, and the kids were wonderful, and the families were really connected. And it felt like that was such a contrast for me from where I'd gone to school myself on in a different part of town. Probably somewhat similar demographic, actually, probably even a little bit better off, although still pretty economically depressed. But there were more families, there were more dads. But it was a huge school. It was just enormous. And we had metal detectors and armed cops.
Mm.
And, you were just, nobody knew you and you were treated like you were in jail pretty much all the time. Even my middle school was like that. And just observing those two things, and that's just one like anecdote. The difference in scale seems to make so much difference in the quality of connection and the quality of life for the people who are in that system. And it seems like our systems are scaling up and up and up. So
Mm.
we're thinking institutionally, and we're communicating to the masses through Twitter or whatever we're on, and the internet, these big big platforms. And as institutions grow and are more bureaucratic and are trying to serve everybody, they stop serving anybody very well, it seems. And I've wondered if some of these ideas just become sort of viral within that milieu. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, there's no question, I think, that, you know, social media and technologies have now almost are taken over our lives. Um, having not grown up with the era of the internet and then being introduced to it. And like I literally did not have a cell phone until recently when I retired. My wife insisted I have to uh, become part of the real world. But I, ran a business for years where I didn't have a phone.
Mhm.
And the thought that someone can thinks that they can contact me 24 hours a day is absolutely crazy. So even though now I don't have it around, I'll get it when I need it.
Yeah.
But looking at particularly my younger daughters, I mean, they're glued to these things, growing up through, and I wasn't a particularly favored father because I did not want them to have it until it was, I got overridden.
Mhm.
And now almost everyone, it's mandatory that they have, uh, a smartphone or whatever you call them.
Mhm.
Has that has that really changed everything? Well, yes, because I believe I just saw one of your posts. You said that you just recently went on to social media and on X or things like that. And I actually just went on it myself because I wanted to promote my new book, End of the World. And
Mhm.
the publicist says, yes, get on that, get an account, do that. That will all help. And
Mhm.
then you see nothing but this shit all the time. People put up this stuff, and if that's all they're looking at, they're not looking at real news sources.
Mhm.
You can see, and you can see it's addictive too.
Mhm.
You
Yeah.
just want to see a new feed, something really quick. Nobody reads anymore. So really, they don't learn how to write. Now with the generative AI, uh, what's going to be of the new generation?
Mhm.
Will they be even able to type an email?
Mhm.
I don't want to be too cynical, but that's part of my nature.
Mhm.
Um, it it well, you're seeing that now school systems are trying to ban the use of phones during school time
Mhm.
because they feel it's detrimental to their learning.
Mhm.
And so, of course, it's not surprising that we're going to see more and more studies and discussions about how AI and all this stuff is going to have a deleterious effect on our
Mhm.
psyches.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, it's fascinating and concerning. Do you want to say a little bit about your book? The End of the World? That's really intriguing.
Well, sure. I have many different interests, so and write in different fields in philosophy and cultural studies, and not just in psychology or psychoanalysis. But um, my latest book is really looking at these greater existential threats to civilization and its fate, and so. Everything from the climate crisis to the future projection of having overpopulated world
Mhm.
with more and more natural resources that are going to be scarce, such as food, water, land,
Mhm.
human aggression and evil, the likelihood of a third world war, which I predict, hopefully not with nuclear engagement. But various, catastrophic global risks to our existence and in AI and economic disparities and religious fundamental extremism and terrorism and all these topics I cover in the book. Yeah.
Sounds joyful.
Well, that's how I work out my own neurosis.
Yeah. Are you optimistic, or do you feel like we're heading downward?
Um, I usually am optimistic only for myself and my family. So, no, I'm more of a pessimist about others.
Mm.
Um, I I hope we get our head out of the sand. I
Mhm.
hope that we no longer remain unconscious of these bigger issues, which I think most of the world is.
Mhm.
They're not seeing the big picture. They are like global bystanders.
Mm.
And I'm hoping if we can start having honest, open, and non-defensive, conversations among family and friends
Mhm.
to start, it will
Mhm.
lead to uh, more of a ecological and more humanistic consciousness that can
What
bring about better things.
What do you think the most important conversations people could be having are for the purposes of this?
Well, you have the climate emergency. I really, if people want to live in denial and say there's no such thing as man-made climate change that's encroaching upon our livelihood and our well-being and our existence, then uh, it's hard to have a discussion with someone who lives in denial.
Mm.
But but that would be one thing, given that wildfires are burning throughout North America again, and and it was 53 degrees Celsius in India last month, which is 127 degrees Fahrenheit, which you
Mm.
cannot live in.
Mm.
These are important questions, issues about international politics and geopolitics. Why should we care about that? Well, because all it takes is some type of a nuclear event, and the rest of the world will immediately be involved,
Mm.
if, and hopefully not a nuclear winter.
Mhm.
So there are so many different aspects of our world crises.
Mm.
Um, you know, the the Islamism that's taking front and center stage now, the extreme
Mhm.
um, radical fundamentalists and terrorist groups. They have quite a propaganda campaign and
Mm.
uh, and duping many people who are involved in campus protests um, to think that somehow Hamas and Hezbollah which are proxies to Iran um, have no threat to the world. Well, they do,
Mm.
and yet these are complex and nuanced conversations that require a lot of education to understand what's going on. It's not a simple, again, oppressor, colonizer, the oppressed, the horrible West
Mhm.
against the rest of us scenarios.
Mm.
It's in a globalized world, it's not that simple.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I think that's definitely true. It's not that simple. And well, do you have any recommendations or links that you'd like to direct people to, or places that they could find your work?
Well, yes, if you want to check out my website, I'm at philosophyspsychoanalysis.com, or you can just Google my name, and I'm sure I'll pop up. If you're interested in my books, you can find them on Amazon or on my website.
Well, John, it's been a pleasure to speak with you, and I hope people enjoy the conversation. Thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you for having me, Leslie.